is very simple. We need to pay the ultimate price for the ultimate ideals for three reasons. Firstly, people can die, but they must never die in vain. Secondly, war is temporary, but oppression is permanent and it will become worse if we do not stop it. And last but not least, the right to self-defense of individuals can never be traded for political expediency. And under all these 3 points of extension, I'm going to rebut whatever they mentioned. Namely, firstly, that Afghanistan and Iraq was in a terrible situation. Secondly, we forced people to revolution. And last but not least, we reduced international engagement with these dictators. I do not know why that's so important to begin with. So firstly, people can die, but they must never die in vain. Let us understand that at some point in today's debate, both sides will have to agree that some people will die. But in our situation, we say that the people who die are those people who want to overthrow the government. Like they know that they are in an inferior or they are in a disadvantageous position, and yet they are willing to take up arms against the government with tanks. We say that the second group of people who die are the soldiers, right? For example, the soldiers from the United States. People who have pledged themselves to the loyalty of the country, but also to what the country stands for, of democracy, of individual human rights. For these two groups of people, yes, they died, but they chose to die and they were proud to die. But in your situation, who are the people who die? The people who die under oppression, the innocent civilians and innocent citizens who want a better living, but are unable to do so. The moment they want to improve their neighborhood or their communities, the government shut them down because of political dissent. More importantly, these governments are also very oppressive when it comes to minorities, when it comes to the more vulnerable people in society, like the women and the children. When these people die, they are innocent and they never chose to die. In the comparative between who dies, we understand that it's in our situation where people die for a greater cause. But more importantly, we also argue that in our situation, less people die because of my second point, that war is temporary, but oppression is permanent and only gets worse. Under their logic, they say that some human rights are worth protecting, but we just don't use force. So it is their duty to tell us that if some human rights are so worth protecting, what happens when all your other options, like for example diplomacy, for example economic sanctions, fail? They never once came back to a response to that. They just say that it's important. But we are the side that believes that when we say something is important, that it materializes in actual action. We are also the side that believes, no thank you, that in your situation, oppression is permanent and only gets worse. Because like what you mentioned over there, right, that these dictators, they do not care about their people over there. They want to hold on to power and they are willing to use military force to oppress their very own citizens. Even in the examples of Afghanistan and Iraq, we still win those points. In the example of Iraq, they talk about sectarian violence, but they never once question, why is it that in such a post-conflict society, sectarian violence will even exist? Is it because there's too much democracy, or was it because there was too little democracy in the preceding regime? Saddam Hussein was the dictator who allowed one sector of society to use violence and to use the threat of murder to oppress the rest of society. Saddam Hussein was also the dictator that waged a campaign and used chemical weapons against the Kurds. This is a society that once believed that the way to get your best interest is to kill or to injure your fellow neighbors. Perhaps that's the reason why sectarian violence exists. But it's in our situation where we say that the use of force against your neighbors, the use of force against the right to life of the fellow citizens is not to be condoned. And that just as how we are able to remove the dictators, we are willing to remove the next party or the next group of people who are going to use chemical weapons, who are going to use these acts of violence. Yes?
In your policy, tell me, who exactly will be doing these things?
I think OG answered that question when they said that we are probably going to use, like, for example, the United Nations, use the coalition of building. I think what you really want to say is that there were mistakes that were made in the past. But the question in today's debate is just because there were some mistakes made in the past doesn't mean that in principle that human rights are not worth protecting to the point of military force. And more importantly, that we do not have the ability to learn from our mistakes and to intervene in a situation whereby all your other options have failed. The last issue, right, the right to self-defense and how we can never trade for political expediency, and this is the core extension that we really want to talk about. Let's understand one thing, that when we say that we intervene in humanitarian crises in other countries. Or for example, when we say that we want to defend people against the oppressive government, what we are really saying is that the fundamental right to self-defense of these people is worth protecting. Let us understand why we even want to protect human rights. Yes, it's about numbers, like the number of lives that we save. But it's also because we understand that morality is something that only makes sense if it's going to be carried out. That is the reason why in a domestic setting, like for example, I mean, you can talk about cultural relativism, but even in those corrupt countries or even in those oppressive regimes, that they do have courts, they do have certain crimes, and they do have certain criminal standards, which goes to show that there are certain human rights or there are certain values that we hold to. But using the domestic analogy as an example, it goes to show that morality is a pursuit or is a goal of every single civilization, and that the only way to realize it is to see it being enacted day in, day out. That's why our courts have to be consistent. But the only problem, ladies and gentlemen, is that the moment an invisible boundary called national borders exists, then somehow this consistency, somehow this pursuit of human rights, of human dignity, somehow is not as important as before. And we want to stop such a situation, because such a situation firstly contradicts every single principle that we stand for, but secondly also creates the precise kind of environment where human rights will be violated. This is something that we have to understand, right? That in the case where we are going to remove the option of military force out of the toolbox of options, this means that dictators will not have any incentive to engage. Like, dealing with that point, if you really want to engage with them, you jolly also want to have an outcome out of this kind of negotiation, right? Because like under your situation, you are unable to pressure them, because under their situation, the way that the government can stay in power is to oppress its people, and the international community can do nothing about that. But in our situation, the calculus of the government changes, because now you understand that if it's going to cause more human rights abuses, it may very well precipitate the next military force is going to remove it out of power. Ladies and gentlemen, we are willing to pay the highest price because we know that this is the ideal that is most important and core to human civilization.